on its agenda. I think that's extremely important. When a few weeks ago, my good friend Arturo Cabrera gave me a phone call to say that he would like me to be here to talk to you about migration, I was a little bit hesitant. I talk so much about migration. It's a constant challenge to me, and I asked myself the question at the end of it, did you say something meaningful? Did you say something new? So while I was hesitant, he came to see me. And then I thought, well, I can't disappoint me. I can't disappoint him. This time I must sit down and try to convey something about migration which might be relevant to the G77 group in China. And that was a big challenge. I threw my presentation away after a while because I thought in 10 minutes I've got to try to convey to you some of the essential challenges which I think that this community should address. And I'm going to talk to you essentially about three things. Now, this is the tweet community. We live now in a world where messages are very, very short. So here are my three short themes for today. First, I'm going to talk about three disconnects in policy, which I think the G77 and China community can do something about. The first disconnect is about what I call our failure to take into account the implications of the death of distance. The death of distance. And what we can do or ought to do about it. And how we failed to do it, something very meaningful until now. My second point will be about the lottery of birth, which is essentially how migration occurs today. It is a lottery, and it's largely based on where you're born. And my third topic will be about the disconnect between perceptions and reality. There's a huge gap between the way in which the world perceives migration, particularly in the West, and its reality. So let me go through each of these very quickly. What do I mean by death of distance? Well, more than 50 years ago, the international community, represented essentially by its ministers of trade and finance, and incidentally, ministers of migration were not present, they took a hugely important decision. They decided that the model of growth that the community, the international community, would adopt was based on growth and competition. Now, you can discuss this. Maybe it wasn't wise. I think in many ways it was not wise. But be that as it may, there's nothing we can do about it. That was the model which was chosen. And that model was based essentially on growth, or having greater and greater growth, through the exchange of certain units of value, particularly units of capital and trade in services and trade in goods. Now, what was not apparent at this stage is that that decision would have tremendous impact on human mobility. But no one thought about it at that time. We now are living with its consequences. And the biggest problem, therefore, is that because mobility was not integrated within that package, we today, in 2017, still do not have an overarching system of governance to manage human mobility. That is the challenge I would put in front of you. How do we do it? Where do we start? Why has it taken so long for us to become aware of it? And while we were doing nothing or very little about it, the world has become more and more mobile. In fact, even while we were failing to look at the policies of mobility, we were at the same time decreasing the cost of travel and vastly increasing our means of communication. So here we are, I sum it up, in a world where travel is very easy and invitations to travel are everywhere, on the web, on the computer, through the phone, and we have not really come to terms with how we're going to manage that reality. Now that leads me to my second point. Why should it matter to G77 countries and to China? Well, it matters a great deal because in the absence of that overarching system of governance on mobility, we have allowed migration to occur essentially on the basis of a lottery. Now, why do I call it a lottery? In preparation for our World Migration Report 2018, which has just come out, by the way, that is a little commercial, and I recommend it to you very, very strongly. It will say in much more detailed words what I'm saying today. It's available on the net, and I'm happy to provide you with a link in English only now, but very soon in French and in Spanish. The lottery of birth. One of the studies we did in the preparation of our World Migration Report is to correlate the Human Development Index and an index on visa facilitation. One index looks at how developed a country is, and Ecuador is in good position in there, and the other index look at how easy or difficult it is to obtain a visa. Now, I won't bore you with the figures, but what that correlation shows blindingly is that if you happen to be born through what I call the lottery of birth in a highly developed country, the world is your oyster. If you were born in Norway, in Switzerland, in Australia and Canada, in the US, you can pretty much travel everywhere you want to, and it's not really difficult for you to get a visa to work. Unfortunately, the same is true also if you're at the bottom of the human development ladder. If fate has decreed that you're born in Yemen, or in Somalia, or in any number of these countries desperately struggling to put together their economies and their governance, then your chances of getting a visa to a developed country are extremely low and very often nil. So what can we do about the lottery of birth? I think this is a powerful question that's confronting this community. But you know what? Let me now extend that paradigm a little bit further. You know, for people like me who are gray-haired, it means that they went to university, to high school and university at a time when the thinking was dominated by a great thinker by the name of Marx. Now, over the years, I've moved away from the Marxist ideology I was taught at university. But you know, some of the things he said are still meaningful. In other words, we still live in a world that's very class-bound. And if you look at migration, you'll find that it is still class-bound. So you have the lottery of birth, first of all, and then you have a number of tribes, and you are all members of that tribe. The educated international elite, who can travel very easily. And at the other end of the ladder, there are those who can't. I often think about it in Geneva, where I live. If you happen to be a diplomat, and many of you are, you have no trouble getting into that country and being able to perform the services that your country requires you to. But guess what? The homes of these diplomats are cleaned by domestics. And for these domestics, the migration regime is totally different. They very often had to enter into that country irregularly and work in what I call grey labor zones. Very vulnerable, struggling to survive. Why do we have that divide? And what can we do about it? Let me finish very briefly then with a third of the disconnects. In that divided world, The perceptions and the myths on migration are incredibly toxic. My Director General, William Swing, often speaks about the need for us to demythologize migration. The myths are destructive and they are toxic. Migrants are those, and very often contradictory, by the way, because how can you resolve the fact that we are told at the very same time that migrants are lazy and only come in to sponge on welfare, and they also come to steal the jobs of the local workers? You can't have it both ways, can you? But that's how myths operate. The linkages that are made between migrants, between criminality, between social tensions, and unfortunately also between migrants and extremism and terrorism have to be set aside. And I think that this community can do something about it to restore the discourse on migration to sanity. So let me complete very quickly. I've gone just over my 10 minutes now. In a couple of minutes, since I've given you such a dismal tableau of the world of migration, is there hope? Well, let me give you two reasons for hope. One is international, and my colleague George has just drawn attention to the fact that there are two important compacts that the international community has committed to developing. One on migration and one on refugees. Yes, it's going to be an enormous challenge. But if we are to do something about this disconnect, we must make a difference next year when we come together to endorse those compacts. Now, it's not going to be the end point. We'll have a long way to go. But if we agree that this is the point at which the international community agrees that it will look at global governance of migration and global governance of refugees and refugee protection in a sensible and coordinated way, this is where we have to make the difference. But my second reason for hope, well, I find it in this country. And honestly, you may think that I'm going to say, what I'm going to say next is simply because I'm in Ecuador, but that is not true. I knew nothing about the policies of Ecuador until I realized I was coming, and I thought I had to get in touch with my IOM colleagues and find out what is happening in the country. And what I found was extremely impressive and gave me cause to hope. Why? Well, this is a country, first of all, that has done something incredibly simple but incredibly important: acknowledging the reality of migration. Migration is not a problem to be resolved. That's how it's seen in so many countries of the world. Migration is simply, as you must have heard from what I've just said, part of the world we have created. And since it's part of this world, let's acknowledge it and let us work with it. So I applaud Ecuador for having done that simple but extremely important step. And my second reason for hope is that this country has realized that in order to make this happen, we must treat migrants and treat refugees with the dignity they deserve. Hugely important. I mentioned that we need to finish the business of globalization. We started with goods, services, and capital. And we must move to that most important human resources of all, which is human capital. But there is a difference there. As far as I know, goods, capital, and services do not have human rights and do not need human dignity. We cannot make people move. We cannot manage their labor mobility without all the time bearing in mind that they are human beings, vested with human rights and dignity. And Ecuador does that very well. And thirdly, I could go on forever because I've learned so much about Ecuador, but let me also congratulate you with your decision to mainstream migration. Please, if it is to work, you cannot park it on one side and say we're going to have one little ministry that will deal with human mobility on the side. It won't happen that way. The only way to do it is to really mobilize migration, to mainstream it through all other policies. Health policies, work policies, employment policies, social policies. Migration must find its rightful place in all of these places. So let me note on that hope. What has been done here fills me with a hope that we can also achieve it elsewhere. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mil gracias, amigo Gervais.